Welcome to another episode of Incredible Teams, the show that explores the tales behind the world's best teams, the tactics that got them there, and how you can use some of them to apply to your own. This is your host, Liam Hurd, and today's episode is one I'm super excited for, one I was even hesitant to put out to cover. It follows the team from my favorite ever book, a book I've read probably 5 or 6 times now. And that book is The Boys in the Boat by author Daniel James Brown. And it covers the story of the University of Washington Huskies rowing team, the men's 8, from 1933 to 1937. I know, very obscure, but the story is incredible. It's beautifully written, and it was actually adapted into a film last year. George Clooney was the director, which is pretty cool. So let's begin. We need to turn back the time a little bit to begin. We're going to go back all the way to March 31st, 1914 in Spokane, Washington, when a boy by the name of Joe Rance was born. Now, Mr. Rance, he grew up pretty poor, and when he was 4 years old, his mother died of throat cancer. A few years later, his stepmother gave Joe's father an ultimatum. She could no longer see a way to feed her strange stepson and her 2 actual birth sons. She told his father, either Joe leaves or I do. Harry had to make the heartbreaking decision to essentially kick Joe out of his own home. He couldn't bear to lose a second wife. Joe was 10. Can you imagine being abandoned at 10 years old and sort of having to figure out how to survive by yourself? It's kind of horrible to think about. To survive, Joe spent hours and hours clambering up the sides of the mountains, chopping wood, and hauling it back to the small schoolhouse where he was living as payment for a roof to sleep under. These horrible circumstances thankfully only lasted about a few months actually, before the whole family moved west over to just north of Seattle, about 400 miles away. Joe was delighted to be reunited with his father, as was his father, and they set about building their new house together from scratch. It was almost 5 years of bliss for Joe. The farm was full of wildlife and excitement. School was going well. He'd formed a close group of friends. But if you know your history, what happened just before 1930 dawned in America? In October of 1929, the Great Depression brought a change in fortunes. The farm was no longer profitable, and his father had another heartbreaking decision to make. Not less than a month later, Joe was dropped off by the school bus to find the family car packed and idling. Listen to this as author Daniel James Brown describes the conversation here between Joe and his father, Harry. "What's up, Pop? Where are we going?" Joe murmured. "We can't make it here, Joe. There's nothing else for it. Thula," who is Joe's stepmother, "won't stay at any rate. She's insisting." "Where are we going to go?" Harry turned to meet Joe's eyes. "I'm not sure. Seattle for now. Then California, maybe. But son, the thing is, Thula wants you to stay here. I would stay with you, but I can't. The little kids are going to need a father more than you are. You're pretty much all grown up now anyway." After that, Joe managed only one more sentence. No begging or complaining, just simply, "But can't I just come along?" And his father, whose eyes had gone blank and cold by this point, replied, "No, that won't work. Look, son, if there's one thing I figured out about life, it's that if you want to be happy, you have to learn how to be happy on your own." And then, just like that, his father turned, strode to the car, and drove away. Joe was 14. He'd just been abandoned for the second time in his life. The depression that should follow after a horrible traumatic experience like that never really found a lodging in Joe's life. Instead, he was fixed with a resolve to survive. Joe promised himself then and there that night he would never ever depend on anyone else again in any aspect of life, and that included friends and family. So he set about making ends meet both through hard labor, felling trees, and through also more nefarious means like stealing bootleg rum, because it was prohibition, and poaching salmon. Over the next 2 years, he not only survived, but truly thrived. And in 1931, his older brother Fred invited him to move to Seattle, not too far away, with the plan to further improve his school grades in preparation for application to university. He did very well, excelling now with 3 meals a day in his belly and no backbreaking job to worry about. And at the end of the year, he was accepted to the University of Washington and set about at a mad scramble over the summer to scrounge up just enough money for his freshman year tuition. He would worry about the second, third, and fourth years later. So on October the 8th, 1933, about a month or so into his freshman semester, Joe Rance stood nervously with 174 other freshmen in the shell house. It was the first day of the freshman rowing crew trial, and Joe knew he might not really belong there at all. He certainly couldn't stay long in the world of perfectly worn trousers, interesting ideas, and educated conversation if things did not go well in the shell house. You see, the thing is, a spot on the freshman crew would not mean a rowing scholarship, because those didn't exist yet, but it would mean the guarantee of a part-time job somewhere on campus, and that alone would help him to get through college. It wasn't really about the rowing, it was about the part-time job. Now, the sport of rowing itself, I'm going to touch on that briefly now. It's both a science and a beautiful art, both part brute force and part extremely precise balance. But most of all, competitive rowing at the highest level is very incredibly painful. Nearly every muscle in the body is working at a rate that muscles just really don't usually work at. In fact, physiologists have calculated that rowing a 2,000-meter race, which is the Olympic standard, takes the same physiological toll as playing 2 basketball games back to back, and that's in about 6 minutes. Pound for pound, Olympic oarsmen may take in as much oxygen as a thoroughbred horse. So, as Joe stood contemplating his chances of making that freshman team, he and most of the boys next to him had no idea, actually all of the boys next to him, had no idea the immense struggle they would have to endure over the next few weeks and months. Joe was trying out specifically for the 8-man crew, which is what many consider to be the pinnacle of rowing. I'm sure some rowers would disagree with that. So in this format, there's 8 rowers and 1 coxswain who sits at the back of the boat and steers the boat and controls the pace by communicating with the big man sitting right in front of him, which is called the stroke oarsman, or number 8. Now the coxswain is tiny. The smaller the better, so the rowers don't have to carry any extra weight. So in 1933, a man by the name of Tom Bowles was the freshman coach, and his role lay in educating this fresh crop of men on the art and skill of rowing. Now, unlike pretty much any other sport in the country, collegiate sport that is, the young men gathered before him had, for the most part, never ever participated in the sport that they were trying out for. It was both intimidating for Bowles, but also exciting because he had this truly blank canvas of talent standing in front of him. His main task was to whittle down that 170, was it 4 or 5, down to just a boat of only 9. Before then, though, there would be thousands and thousands of hours at the oar and a lot of blood and sweat. And then the varsity coach was a man by the name of Al Ulbrichtson. To attend high school, he had rowed 2 miles there and 2 miles back every day for 4 years, developing a very, very keen understanding of the water. And then this understanding of the boat and the water led to a spot as the stroke oarsman on the Huskies varsity crew that won national championships in 1924 and 26. So he stayed on and became coach, obviously. And then the stroke is probably the most important position in the boat. That's probably pretty arguable, but one of the most, if not the most. And they have to work extremely, extremely hard. The stroke sets the rhythm and the stroke rate for all of those behind him. The famous New Zealand rower, a man by the name of Dudley Story, describes the ideal qualities of the stroke as a person who is half mad, who loves to go, loves to fight, and loves to be amongst it all the time, and can instill some of their qualities into the people behind. So, as a coach, Ulbrichtson was very, very respected by his boys, almost kind of put on a pedestal, almost revered, and the press felt similarly. He was also a man of very, very few words, so anything he said was taken very seriously by all who heard it. As the freshmen pulled their first wobbly strokes of an oar, Ulbrichtson stood at a distance, silent in the shadows, observing and judging. As the head coach, he knew that this uncoordinated, bumbling group was incredibly important to his ambitions a mere 3 years later, the 1936 Olympics. You see, the last 4 8-man Olympic gold medals had been won by teams representing the US. In 1920, it was the United States Naval Academy, and then it was Yale, and then the University of California, Berkeley, or UCal, in both 1928 and 32. Ulbrichtson was itching for his own success, and he knew that these boys, right in front of him now, who could barely pull an oar, would form some of, if not most of the boat that might get them to Berlin. Collegiate rowing during the 20s and 30s was a very, very popular sport, rivaling college football in the amount of attention it received throughout the country and throughout the press. Now, in the East, rowing was seen as sort of like this pastime of the upper class. The Yales and Harvards and all of the Ivy League modeled their programs after elite British institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, who taught rowing as a gentleman's sport. But in the far west, only 50 or so years removed from essentially being the frontier, depending on where exactly you were living, rowing was anything but gentlemanly. Until the late 1920s, both UCal and the Huskies had struggled for recognition and funding, but things were beginning to change, I would say. As the Western programs began finding occasional success, they began to grow a large alumni and fan base who understood this crucial part that a successful crew program could bring recognition and prestige to the school. The Cal and Washington rivalry intensified as both programs struggled back and forth to take the Western crown from each other. As I mentioned just a second ago, the Golden Bears of Cal were the reigning double Olympic champions in the 8th, which obviously Ulbrichtson and Washington did not like. I suppose you could say if collegiate rowing had sort of like an epicenter or a movable spiritual home, it seemed like in 1933 it had begun the trek west, but not to Washington, but California. If Ulbrichtson wanted to change that, success in 1936 was crucial. So as Joe Rance settled into his routine of classes and crew practice in the evenings, he noticed a couple of key themes that the coach Bowles began to talk about over and over. And those themes are going to continue to pop up today, so I think it's kind of worth to call them out here. Firstly, that the boys heard time and time again that the course they had chosen to embark on was difficult almost beyond imagining. that both their bodies and their moral characters would be tested in the months ahead, that only a very few of them who possessed near superhuman physical endurance and mental toughness would prove good enough to wear the W on their chests. Well, we already touched on how hard rowing is, but sort of beyond that obvious sort of motivational theme, there was something else that Bowles talked about that rowing could bring. He talked of near mystical moments on the water, moments of pride, elation, and deep affection for one's fellow oarsmen, moments they would remember and cherish and recount to their grandchildren about when they were old men, moments even that would bring them closer to God. Bowles had learned most of what he was now lecturing the freshmen on from a man by the name of George Pocock, who is unfortunately, given the length of the episode, going to be a minor figure in our story today, but he's incredibly important to the program nonetheless. Pocock, if you take him at face value, and by his job description, was a boat builder. Not just for the Huskies, but for rowing programs throughout the world. From the 1920s to the 60s, Pocock was widely regarded as the best boat builder on the planet. His shells that he made in his little workshop were constantly in high demand. But Pocock was so much more than just a boat builder, especially to the Washington program. His workshop, you see, was housed just above the rickety boat shed where the precious Pocock shells were actually stored. And Pocock, I suppose, could be described as a sort of special advisor to the Washington program. His understanding of the details of the sport, the physics of water and wood, and the biomechanics of muscle and bone were unmatched. But beyond his understanding of those physical elements of rowing and the back-breaking work it took, Pocock understood something deeper. Those mystical moments that Coach Bowles consistently reminded the freshmen about was from a Pocock theory that sort of went like this. When 8 boys and a coxswain trusted each other completely and spent thousands of hours in extreme pain together, something profound could happen. The 9 individuals in the boat could somehow become one thing. Effort replaced by ecstasy, the screaming muscles quieting, and in place, a living, gliding embodiment of the divine. It was a rare thing, a thing to hope for, a thing only a special crew could attain, a thing, as we will hear later on, Joe Rance and 8 others will eventually find. But in 1933, Rance was a long way from that. Before even beginning to touch, even thinking of touching a beautiful Pocock shell, the freshmen needed to learn how to row. So each afternoon they jumped into the training boat, 16 at a time. Ulrichsen and Bowles paced up and down the center walkway, Bowles hollering and correcting and shouting and screaming every few seconds, and Ulrichsen just kind of moving up and down, silently observing. Brown describes the routine as the workouts lasted for 3 hours every afternoon. By the time the boys came in off the water each night, their hands were blistered and bleeding, their arms and legs throbbed, their backs ached, and they were soaked through with a mixture of sweat and lake water. The brutal nature of this daily routine quickly took its toll on the, shall we say, weaker-minded, perhaps less motivated population of that 175. First to drop were the boys whose clothes were clean and new and perfectly pressed, the boys from perhaps more well-to-do families, and the smaller and smaller group of returners began to look and sound a little more like Joe, maybe a bit rougher around the edges, in some cases a little more guarded and careful with their words, and nearly always they had an education in hard manual labor. As the fall disappeared, the beginnings of the Pacific Northwest winter brought new challenges for the remaining freshmen. chief among those, the loss of feeling in their exposed hands for hours and hours each evening. And only 2 months later, that 175 was down to 80. Coach Bowles decided to move the most promising of those prospects to the next stage, and Rance is one of the chosen few to begin training in boats that look similar to the actual racing shells but were a few inches wider and therefore slightly less likely to capsize. And a month later, just before December, the first freshman crew boat was named. Rance was picked at the number 3 seat. He had taken one small step towards the Berlin Olympics and one giant leap towards staying in school with the reward of a part-time job. So they departed for the winter break, and in January, the first and second boats finally stepped into those Pocock racing shells to begin the last phase of their prep. The training now jumped to another level of intensity. Bowles began to focus their minds on the first and perhaps only race of the season, which was the Pacific Coast Regatta, which was against Cal's freshman boat. If they managed to win that, then a trip east to compete for the national title was on the cards. But there was about another 400 or so hours at the oar needed before that could even come close to happening. The training frequency increased to 6 days a week, and boys were beginning to be swapped in and out of boats, with the coaches trying to find the perfect combination. It was sort of like trying to solve a complex moving puzzle. A few months later, in early April, Bowles had his boat. They were rowing at a near record-setting level in time trials and beating both the JV and varsity boats in mock races. Which is kind of crazy to think about, that they're only a few months into rowing and they're already beating these seniors and juniors and sophomores. In early April of 1934, Rance and his freshmen lined up alongside the Cal freshmen in a winner-take-all 2,000-meter sprint that would only last a few horrible, painful minutes. During those few minutes, each of them would take more than 300 strokes. With 8 oarsmen in the boat, oars would have to enter and exit the water cleanly more than 2,400 times. If just one boy muffed just one of those strokes, the race would effectively be over. So that's a good framing of just how important the margins, how perfect you have to be when rowing one of these races. Cal jumped out to a fast lead, rowing at a furious but unsustainable pace of about 38 strokes per minute. The Huskies were kept at a kind of a leisurely 30 strokes and about a quarter of a boat length back. Ever so slowly, the Washington boat crept forward, pulling level, then ahead, all the while at that smooth 30-stroke pace. With 500 meters to go, the Cowcocks began to panic and tried to raise the stroke, but his boys were done. Meanwhile, Washington took it up to 32, then 36 to win by over 4 boat lengths and break the freshman record. It was a remarkable victory for all involved, but especially for Joe. Here was a young man who had promised himself to never ever rely on anyone else, to never trust, and yet only 6 or so months into a new sport that relied on blind trust, he was part of a record-setting performance. Perhaps you'll begin to notice this theme pop up again and again as Joe and his crewmates leave their individualism behind whenever they step into a Pocock shell. 2 months later, they were headed east. The Intercollegiate Rowing Association meet served as pretty much the national championship. Sure, Harvard and Yale skipped it each year out of some sort of nod to tradition, but most of the rest of the Ivy League was there, plus several other successful crews from around the country. As we always touched on earlier, it had always been sort of an Eastern-dominated affair, but things were beginning to shift. Nevertheless, Eastern fans, alumni, sports writers, and the national press as well were accustomed to seeing the sons of senators and governors and even presidents, not farmers and fishermen and lumberjacks, sitting on the Hudson. Rance and his crew had stumbled into an arena about as far from rural Washington as possible. They were drawn in lane 3 next to Syracuse, who had won 3 of the last 4 freshman titles. The Syracuse Orange were naturally favorites and jumped out to a solid lead rowing at 34, but once again, the Huskies crept slowly past at a low stroke rate. There was just so much power in the boat and those oars that they just pulled away. About 500 meters left to go, the Syracuse boat stumbled, and the Washington boat cruised to a 5-length win. It was almost too easy for them. Ulbrichtsen knew something special was brewing. At the conclusion of the race, the boys hadn't even slumped over exhausted. Instead, they were sitting upright, calm, and collected, almost as if they could have kept on rowing for another 10 miles. The race was the last time the boys rowed together for a few months as they headed off for summer break. Joe returned to scrounging up money for the upcoming school year by hard labor, digging and logging trees. Upon return to university, Joe and his crewmates were now at the full mercy of Ulbrichtsen, which meant a real risk of being split up and moved about through different boats as he tried to find the perfect combination. But a few weeks later, theirs was actually the only returning boat to be kept intact. Ulbrichtsen had reflected over the summer break and decided that there really was something special brewing in this group of sophomores. The endless amounts of rowing continued with another few hundred more hours at the oar. The first day of crew practice in the spring semester in 1935 was unlike any other. For once, Ulbrichtsen was talkative. He spoke freely, even with reporters present, declaring, "At one point or another, Washington crews have won the highest honors in America. They have not, however, participated in the Olympic Games. That's our objective." And to begin building towards his ultimate objective, Ulbrichtsen demanded even greater commitment and effort. Instead of taking a couple of weeks to get back into the swing of things and work on technique while rebuilding a base of fitness, Ulbrichtsen just announced that they would be rowing hard and immediately, and that there would be no more swapping boys in and out of boats. It was to be boat against boat. Brown describes the situation Ulbrichtsen had just created. All-out war promptly broke out in the shell house. Eyes that had been coolly averted from one another before now locked in icy stares. Accidental bumping of shoulders turned into open pushing matches. Locker doors were slammed, curses were exchanged. And so the 5 separate boats that he had sort of organized began a short-lived battle to be named the first varsity crew. It was back and forth every single day with a lot of swapping around on that blackboard where Ulbrichtsen wrote up the rankings. Every time the sophomores were named the number 1 boat, they promptly put in a horrible shift the next day and were demoted. Ulbrichtsen was all but pulling his hair out. Choosing a first boat seemed to be an impossible task. Too impossible, in fact. 2 months later, Ulbrichtsen changed his strategy again and began mixing the crew lineups. He had spotted the problem with the sophomore boat, and it is the reason why this podcast exists. This is the reason I read and write and research and talk to you. It's actually probably the reason you're listening as well. Ulbrichtsen's revelation was this: there were too many days when they rowed, not as crews, but as boatfuls of individuals. The more he scolded them for personal technical issues, even when he preached teammanship, the more the boys seemed to sink into their own separate and sometimes defiant little worlds. Almost every team in every field deals with a variation of this exact problem. Great teams have to overcome their individual agendas and priorities and egos and all manner of things in order to achieve any sort of success. Is that not the key? So, please, keep listening. The rest of this episode is about fixing this problem. It just happens to be through the eyes of Ulbrichtsen, but You can take the principles and ideas that he kind of talks about and we're going to talk about and apply them to your own team. That is the whole premise behind me talking and you listening. As the spring went on in 1935, Ulbrichtsen continued to struggle until the Pacific Coast Regatta rolled around. In early April, he took 3 boats down to the Bay Area and decided to row a winner-take-all time trial to decide who would race in the varsity race. On April 10th, the JV boat smashed Rance and the sophomores by nearly a full boat's length, but still Ulbrichtsen delayed and didn't choose. The day before the race, it was the same result. Surely now the JV boat would be promoted to the varsity. But Ulbrichtsen tried one more thing. He swapped the sophomores back to their older Pocock shell and watched them match the JV time. At dinner, going back on his word, he announced that the sophomores would be racing the varsity race. He explained to the press that they were potentially the best crew I've ever coached. The JV crew were rightly very pissed off, and a principled man like Ulbrichtsen felt horrible. But ever since he had seen them row so smoothly less than a year prior, he knew there was something pretty special in that boat. Despite being very inconsistent, he just had to stick with them and stick with his gut. The next day, that demoted JV boat won their race by a staggering 8 boat lengths. At the finish line, instead of slowing and cruising, they were still accelerating, seemingly giving a direct middle finger to Ulbrichtsen. So, as Joe Rance and the rest of the sophomores slid toward that start line, they were rightly anxious to put in a good performance. They had to respond, not to the cowboat, which was rocking beside them, but to their fellow Huskies they had just rowed. It was, according to the San Francisco Chronicle's grizzled sports editor, the best race he ever saw on the estuary. Cal led for most of the race, rowing at a stroke rate between 34 and the punishing, soul-sucking Furious 40. Nevertheless, the Huskies were never really too far behind, while rowing at a far lower stroke rate of 30 to 34. As the Cal boat relied on faster and faster and more erratic strokes to keep the lead, Washington relied on the Ulbrichtsen tactic to keep the rate low but the strokes powerful. As the boats hurtled toward the finish line, the Husky coxswain screamed for 10 big ones and then again 10 more big ones, and Washington surged into the lead to cap a truly wonderful day for the Husky program. They'd swept the Golden Bears in California, proving once again that they were the superior program on the West Coast, and immediately boosting their chances to represent the US the following year in Berlin. Like in 1934, the national championship meet would serve as another opportunity to measure up against the finest the East had to offer. But Ulbrichtsen didn't know who would be rowing in that first boat for the national championship meet. The sophomores had returned to another slump after beating Cal, and the JV boat was looking stronger and stronger each day. The season-long dark arts campaign of taunting and gamesmanship suited the older, more experienced boys far, far more than the younger gentlemen, who simply struggled to put in a good performance whenever they rowed a mock race. Rowing time trials was a completely different story, but as you know by now, rowing is not a time trial based sport. You have competitors lined up right next to you. As they traveled to New York, Ulbrichtsen was 90% sure it would be his JV crew competing as that varsity boat. The performance and preparation for the race confirmed it, sort of that time trial they did again the day before, or a few days before. The sophomores came in a staggering 8 lengths behind the other boat. So that finally settled it. Ulbrichtsen threw in the towel. The sophomores were officially demoted to JV, and the older boys would row as the varsity. For Joe and his crewmates, it was a terrible blow. On the race day itself, Joe and the rest of the downcast sophomores managed to find something that had sort of been missing over the past month: a sense of rhythm. Despite a horrible start They rode slow and powerful for most of the way to cruise to an easy 2-length victory. It went part of the way to soothing their bruised egos, but only a part of the way. Berlin now seemed a long, long way off. In the varsity race, Washington's JV boat led for most of the race until they faded to a third-place finish. Nevertheless, the Huskies returned west for the summer break and the last chance to rest and recuperate before the beginning of the slog to Berlin. Although, as you know by now, Joe Rance was doing anything but resting and recuperating. He was working like an absolute dog to scrounge up enough money to pay tuition for another year of school. As Joe and most of the rest of the boys at Washington were hard at work, Ulrichsen was reflecting and preparing and planning for the campaign ahead. In his journals, he reflected that a successful quest for Olympic gold would require finding 9 young men of strength, grace, endurance, and most of all, mental toughness. Ulrichsen could pretty easily understand and measure the first 3 categories that I just mentioned, and how to improve them. However, that last category was a bit of an enigma, that mental toughness, especially when it came to Joe Rance. Ulrichsen had tried everything. He had scolded Joe, he had encouraged him, he had demoted him, he had re-promoted him, he'd put his arm around him, everything. But he still wasn't any closer to understanding the mystery of him. The solution, he hoped, lay with George Pocock. Perhaps the Englishman could get to the bottom of the mystery and provide some answers. When Joe arrived back on campus in the fall of '35, stronger and ever so slightly more wealthy, Pocock began to chat with him a little more regularly. Eventually, he invited him upstairs into his sacred workshop and explained his methods and philosophy. Joe, as you know, had spent many, many hours working with wood already and had a deep appreciation for that manual labor. Pocock explained that the great slabs of wood would speak to you if you knew how to listen as you worked. As the season began, Joe at times would wander upstairs to observe their master at work, and when he paused, rasping or whittling away, Pocock slowly began to pry out Joe's story. At the same time, training for the Olympic trials began at full speed. Ulrichsen had 4 varsity boats to work with. Rance's sophomore boat, though, unlike the previous year, had already been split up between all 4, and Joe himself was struggling. Do you remember what he had promised to himself the second time he was abandoned by his father? To never trust, to never rely on anyone else. Joe now realized that he had allowed himself to do exactly that, rely on others, those sophomores, with the usual painful results. The close-knit crew was no more, and being moved from boat to boat meant Joe couldn't develop bonds with his crewmates to the same degree. Nevertheless, as always, Joe soldiered on. His mind wasn't truly focused on the rowing, and he didn't have the same trust with his new crew, but he still pulled like hell. The fall season ended with a 2,000-meter race where Joe's boat finished third, an underwhelming finish to a disappointing semester. On the coach's barge, bobbing along in the wake of his beautifully crafted shells, Pocock kept his binoculars trained on Joe. He was getting closer and closer to figuring him out. January of 1936 dawned, and with it came the Olympic dream. So close, only months away. Yet, for Joe, so very far. Ulrichsen issued a stark warning to those who showed up for the first varsity practice. He said that they must be ready to take part in Washington's greatest and most grueling cruise season. And so the slog began. They rowed and rowed through January into February, keeping the snow and sleet, hail, and constant Pacific Northwest rain company. Ulrichsen began mixing boat assignments around again, doing his best to find the winning formula through trial and error. That meant Joe continued to bounce between boats numbered 1, 2, and 3, which of course led to more struggles to trust his crew. How can you develop deep, trusting bonds if your teammates are constantly changing? In early March, Pocock finally broke his silence. He invited Joe up to his workshop, as, he often did, but this time he began to point out a couple of things he'd been seeing. He started slowly and softly on minor technique flaws, before moving on to what he thought was the root cause of Joe's struggles: trust. Or rather, lack of. He suggested that Joe think of a well-rowed race as a symphony, and himself as just one player in the orchestra. After a few other comments, Pocock finished with a remark that Joe would still remember word for word into his 90s. Joe, when you really start trusting those other boys, you'll feel a power at work within you that is far beyond anything you've ever imagined. Sometimes you'll feel like you've rowed right off the planet and are rowing amongst the stars. It was one of the hardest things he ever did. Harder than rowing with numb fingers and lungs screaming. But Joe Rance slowly came to the realization over the next couple days that he would do his best to trust, truly trust the boys he was rowing with, whoever they may be. You might call it fate, or destiny, or luck even. Only a couple weeks later, Ulbrichtson moved Joe into a different boat. This time, he wouldn't be moved again. Their first practice as a crew was incredible. The strokes long and powerful and the rhythm perfect. Climbing out of the shell afterwards, Joe came to a realization. It wasn't so much that he was trying his best to trust, but more so that this was a group of boys he could trust, that he could depend on. They were the number 2 boat on the blackboard, but they began to fly. So much so that only a week later they were named the varsity boat. This was the crew Ulbrichtsen's Olympic dream would depend on. I haven't spoken about any of the other boys yet. I mean, there's already been enough names to kind of keep track of, so I won't add any more. But Brown has a nice synopsis of the makeup of the crew that Joe had just joined. They were all skilled, they were all tough, they were all fiercely determined, but they were also all good-hearted. Every one of them had come from humble origins, or been humbled by the ravages of the hard times in which they had grown up. The challenges they had faced together had taught them humility, the need to subsume their individual egos for the sake of the boat as a whole, and humility was the common gateway through which they were now able to come together. I think the key point from that little quote, that passage there, is that they were all good-hearted. It's very difficult to have consistent success with people who aren't. Over the next month, the new varsity crew kept drawing closer, trusting more, and rowing faster. So much so that Ulbrichtsen was kind of cautiously optimistic when Cal arrived in Seattle in April for the first race of the season. The freshman and JV boats easily bet the Golden Bears, leaving Ulbrichtsen with a chance to sweep for the second year in a row. At the starting line, the oarsmen took their last full breaths and adjusted their balance. It was literally the calm before the ferocious storm of thrashing oars. And thrashing was how they began. Both boats leapt off at a fast and furious 36, with Cal holding a slight edge. Eventually, the Husky cocks employed the Ulbrichtsen technique and tactic to slow the stroke rate way down to about 29, and now they found their rhythm. Despite rowing at so many less strokes per minute, they pulled even, then slightly ahead. Over the next mile, the gap widened, and the cowcocks again snarled for more effort. But no amount of effort was working. The Huskies were flying. With 500 yards to go, the Washington stroke rate bumped up to 32, and the lead grew exponentially. Photographers overhead and airplanes struggled to keep both boats in shot. Brown writes, as they flew down the last few hundred yards, their 8 taut bodies rocked back and forth like pendulums. in perfect synchronicity. Their white blades flashed above the water like the wings of seabirds flying in formation. The final time was an incredible course record, beating the previous one by 37 seconds. As the boys celebrated, Ulbrichtsen contemplated. He knew for certain that he had a proper crew in his hands, but he had also thought the same in previous years when he had beaten Cal. The last couple of seasons, they'd travel east, riding on a high, only to lose. He knew that they needed to stay grounded and humble. Which I suppose is a little easier for a good-hearted crew. 2 months later, out they set for a shot at that national championship again. This time, hopefully the Olympic trials were to follow, and hopefully Berlin. If all went well, they wouldn't be returning to Seattle for over 3 months. Upon arrival in New York, rumors began floating around the town about Cal's practice times. Word had leaked that they had turned in a blazing time of 18:37 over 4 miles, which was 48 seconds faster than the Huskies. While there were concerns in the press, the boys weren't too worried. A couple of days before the actual race, Ulbrichtsen had his crews rowing leisurely at night. Despite rowing at a rate of only 22, the varsity slipped ahead. They didn't mean to, there was just so much power in their oars. Bobby Mock, who is the coxswain, which we'll hear more about in a few minutes, recalled, "You couldn't hear anything except for the oars going in the water. It'd be a zip, and that's all you could hear. The oarlocks didn't even rattle on release." Years and years later, as old men, they would all remember the moment. They were rowing perfectly, fluidly, mindlessly. They were rowing as if on another planet. As if in a black void amongst the stars, just as Pocock had said they might. The boys knew then, if they hadn't already, that their crew was made of some special stuff, even more than Ulbrichtsen had hoped. Race day dawned sunny, with a slight breeze. The varsity race was set to begin at 8 p.m. Due to tidal conditions. Before that, both the Husky freshmen and JV boats won their races. As nearly 100,000 fans waited for the varsity to start, a ripple of excitement raced through the crowd. Washington, for the second year in a row, was on the brink of a Poughkeepsie sweep, which is where the race is, Poughkeepsie. But facing them was Cal, a program trying to become the first to win 4 consecutive varsity races in this competition. And Cornell was expected to challenge too, or maybe Navy, both boats who the Eastern fans could get behind. The atmosphere grew electric as the crew drew up to the starting line. Washington had drawn the worst lane, number 7, way out in the middle of the river, where any breeze or current would affect them. And, of course, Cal had drawn the best lane, hugging the riverbank. Mock, the Washington cox, whispered the race plan as they idled, before quietening to let the boys finish their last-second preparations. And then they were off. For 5 full strokes, all 7 boats were even, and then Washington eased up. Ulbrichtsen's plan was now Bobby Mock's to execute, and it went like this. Row slow, below 30 strokes, but keep at most 2 lengths behind the leaders, before accelerating in the last mile to overtake. Mock almost immediately disobeyed the second part of that plan, and let the Washington boat fall nearly 5 lengths behind. Up front, Cal moved towards the lead. At the 2-mile mark, halfway in the race, the Huskies were still 4 behind. To the Washington coaching contingent, it was beginning to look like sporting suicide. The gap was too much. Mock had been told only 2 lengths. This was double that. Ulbrichtsen, as emotionless as ever, sat unmoving, methodically chewing his gum, trying to beam a message to Mock to get moving. A mile further on, Washington were only 3 back of Cal. Ulbrichtsen had all but given up, but Mock hadn't. He knew his boys still had the bulk of their energy left. One of them even noticed he was still breathing through his nose as they came into the last 1,000 yards. And now the stroke rate began creeping up, 36 and 37, 38 and into the 40s. The boat now began to fly. Almost came out of the water as the 8 boys rowed as one perfectly oiled machine. There were no sounds except for the oars touching water and Mock's rhythmic barking and banging to keep the strokes on time. With 200 yards to go, they began to catch, then draw level, then finally pass Cal. And with each stroke, the Huskies flew a few more yards past the exhausted Californians until the finish line was there and there was a glimmer of open water between the two boats. It was a truly remarkable comeback. I hope you buy this book just for this passage. I had goosebumps. The press was similarly enthralled, which is kind of evidenced by the columns that they wrote the next day. Various reporters said it was a high mark in the history of Poughkeepsie, that it was spectacular and unprecedented. It was a story of psychology, pure nerve, and rowing intelligence. Mock's noodle was the best oar in the Washington boat, and that Mock's performance was positively cold-blooded. Ulrichsen was delighted in private, but muted in public. He wanted to be the first to set an example that the Olympic trials were the most important thing to be thinking about now, not past wins. Joe Rance and co. knew that the Olympic trial was the most important race of their lives, and they did their best to keep an even keel, no pun intended. Ulrichsen also had stern words for Mock for his blatant disobedience in ignoring the race plan. Despite the win, Ulrichsen knew what any good leader knows. Disobedience is not the right way to foster long-term success. Sure, it may work here and there, like Mock demonstrated, but trust immediately starts to erode, and the leader feels like their authority is undermined and under attack. To continue with the theme of concentrating on the next race, Ulrichsen put the crew back to work. The Olympic trials were not to be held over 4 miles, like that race they just rode. Instead, it was back to the all-out 2,000-meter sprint, and a completely different race plan. The race itself was held on Carnegie Lake on the campus of Princeton University, where the US rowing team is still based today, actually. And the trial was between 6 boats that were in 2 prelim heats, with the top 2 in each race meeting in a 4-boat final the next day. In the lead up to the prelims, Washington practiced fast starts and high stroke rowing, something that wasn't really their specialty. As you know, they like to keep the stroke low and come from behind, but kind of coming from behind and keeping it low wouldn't really be an advisable strategy in an all-out sprint, so they kind of changed up the game plan. Their prelim race wasn't really all that dramatic. They kind of shook off some dust, got some good practice in rowing fast, and easily won by 2.5 lengths. Most importantly, though, they did not empty their tank. Unlike in the second heat, Cal really had to expend some energy in order to win. Once again, the next day looked like it was shaping up to be a Washington-Cal showdown. And now the nerves set in. More nerves than the boys had ever felt. More than Ulrichsen had too. They were on the brink of their dream. Because this was no longer intercollegiate rowing, anyone could row in each boat. Gaining an advantage by using older alumni was a tactic that made complete sense. In fact, Washington was the only team out of that 6 who were made up of only undergraduates. The nerves, as I said, flowed in. Not just because of the magnitude of the race, but just as much because of the unknown. The other 3 crews the next day they were facing were supposedly even better than the undergrads Washington had just beaten in Poughkeepsie and other previous races. The unknown was scary. It was hard to plan for. Ulrichsen spent his evening going room to room trying to calm the boys down, offering words of advice or just chatting to get their minds off the next day. That next day, the biggest day of their lives, kind of began a little earlier than they would have liked due to the nerves, which was especially annoying given the race wasn't due to start until 5 p.m. By that time, nearly 10,000 spectators were sprawled all up and down the lake, all of them there to watch only 6 minutes of effort. Can you imagine going to a sporting event for only to watch 6 minutes? But as the boys sat motionless in their pocock shell, effort wasn't really on anyone's mind. Now, full focus was on one thing. The nerves were gone. It was all about rowing in perfect rhythm. The starting gun flashed, and for about 4 or 5 strokes, they were in perfect rhythm, until 2 of the boys slightly misgrooved, which effectively brought the boat to a complete halt. So immediately they went back to work, trying to go all the way back up to 39 to close the gap. Once Bobby Mock was satisfied that the gap wasn't too big, he dropped the stroke rate down back to 34, which is still a lot higher than they're used to rowing at. And Brown writes, "But what a 34 it was. 8 barebacks swung forward and backward in perfect unison. 8 white blades dipped in and out of the mirror-like water at precisely the same instant. Each time the blades entered the lake, they disappeared almost without a splash or ripple. Each time the blades rose from it, the boat ghosted forward without check or hesitation. They kept at that same stroke rate, ever so slightly gaining on the field until the 3/4 mark when Mock let them loose. They took it to 36, swept Pascal, then to 39, then 40 to glide past the leaders Pennsylvania. All of a sudden, there was a boat's length of open water, and the University of Washington was going to the Olympics. As they crossed the line, Bobby Mock, breaking and bending the laws of physics, stood upright and pumped his fist in the air. It was a perfect exclamation on a near-perfect race. Across the country, the state of Washington rejoiced. For the first time ever, their seldom mentioned or thought of state was going to be represented on the international stage. It was truly remarkable. Within a week's time, they would be setting sail for Europe. But in the meantime, they traveled from one upper-class establishment, Princeton University, to another on Long Island where the New York Athletic Club had their training facility. I'm going to kind of skip the details of the voyage because it's not really too relevant to the story of the team, so we'll pick up upon arrival in Germany. And opposite to the voyage details, I think it is important to kind of chat quickly about what Germany was like at the time, and the great deception that the Nazi Party succeeded in pulling off. The Olympic idea for the Nazis was all sort of framed around this idea conjured up by their chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels. He said, "We must be more charming than the Parisians, more easygoing than the Viennese, more vivacious than the Romans, more cosmopolitan than London, more practical than New York." And to accomplish his dream, everything that the Olympic visitors would see, experience, touch, was cleaned and polished and draped in swastikas, made to look perfect. The homeless were taken off the streets and relocated. Forbidden books were redisplayed in shop windows, and prostitutes were treated for disease. Everyone public-facing was fitted in a new uniform. And most importantly, the signs prohibiting Jews from public places were temporarily removed. The perfectly planned set was prepared just in time for the arrival of the world. And from the outset, that deception was evident. The president of the American Olympic Committee proclaimed, "No nation since ancient Greece has captured the true Olympic spirit as has Germany." The presentation of Germany at this time was an effective camouflage for Nazi intentions, and to a degree helped them to continue rearming with less international opposition and attention. But I'm digressing a little. Joe Rance and Ulrichsen and Pocock and the rest of the crew arrived, shook off their sea legs, and began preparing for the race of their lives. One of the boys I haven't mentioned yet is going to kind of play a crucial role over the next few minutes of the story, and he was the stroke for the crew. Remember from earlier, the stroke is probably the most important position in the boat, and they have to work extremely hard to set the rhythm and stroke rate. Don Hume was his name in this boat, and like Joe Rance, he had a laborious upbringing. He'd worked in a pulp mill as a kid, and the fumes in the mill had just ravaged his lungs. So he was susceptible to all sorts of horrible respiratory problems. Also, compared to most strokes, he was undersized, but he had such a natural rhythm on the water that Ulbrichtsen had full trust. On the voyage to Germany, most of the boys had been struck down by some combination of a cold and seasickness, but after a few days on land, they'd all sort of recovered. Not Hume, though. His cold had settled deeper and deeper into his lungs, some sort of horrible infection or respiratory disease. And about 2 weeks before the race was to begin, he could no longer row. He couldn't even get out of bed. Ulrichsen replaced him with a substitute oarsman, but it wasn't the same. Their sluggish practice times got even slower. The rhythm of the boat was completely thrown off by someone they'd never really rowed with. Ulbrichtsen's worry got even worse when he saw the other crews begin their practice sessions. The Germans, sponsored by the state, looked foreboding and machine-like. The Italians, also sponsored by their fascist government, had only just missed gold in 1932 and rowed with tremendous heart. Even the small Japanese crew, who weighed on average 145 pounds, shocked Ulbrichtsen when they took their stroke rate to a ridiculous 56 in practice. That's crazy. That's almost 1 per second. The Australians didn't have much technique, but were clearly built of some sturdy stuff. But most of all, the British frightened Ulbrichtsen. After all, this was their sport. They had tradition and the pick of the finest oarsmen from Oxford and Cambridge. But most frightening was their strategy. It almost exactly mirrored Ulbrichtsen's style to row slow and come from behind. When the Washington boat, with its poor practice times, measured up against these crews, it looked like they would finish last by at least a few boat lengths. Over the next 2 weeks, they continued preparing poorly until Ulbrichtsen grounded them with only 6 days to go. There would be no more sightseeing. He was frustrated at their progress, perhaps just as frustrated at the race organizers. There had never been a 6-lane Olympic rowing race before, which wasn't an issue in itself, but the issue did stem from the fact that the added 5th and 6th lanes were fully exposed out in the middle of the lake. In fact, Ulbrichtsen had stopped one of their practices out there for fear of capsize. The waves were that big and the wind that strong. Ulbrichtsen's complaints landed on deaf ears, and just perhaps ears that didn't like hearing complaints when it came to lane assignments. In the final days before the prelim race, the boat finally began to row properly. Hume had returned despite still not feeling great, which helped with the rhythm, but more importantly, the boys now grew very serious about the race. They took to huddling on the dock before they got into the water, offering advice and talking over race plans. The Husky Clipper, which was what their boat was called, responded beautifully. Finally performing well, Ulbrichtsen tapered the mileage, and they rested. The prelims were scheduled for the 12th, with the winner of the prelim, there was multiple of them, advancing to the final on the 14th, and the losers of that prelim race would have another chance to make the final by racing in what's called a repechage on the 13th. But if you lose that first race, try and win the next race the next day. That's 3 races in 3 days if you make it to the final, which would be a lot of racing volume in a short period of time. So the prelims were the key to gain a rest day. The Huskies, the US, were drawn alongside Britain in their prelim, the crew that Ulbrichtsen was most worried about. On the day of the race, Don Hume weighed in at 158 pounds, 14 less than a month earlier at Poughkeepsie. His 6'2" frame had bones poking out in all the wrong places, and to add to that, a fever was racking his body. Nevertheless, he was adamant he would row. So, in the late afternoon, Ulbrichtsen pulled him from bed and helped him onto the team bus. At 5:15 p.m. that evening, the Husky Clipper was idling at the start line. Hume had his mind fully in the boat, able to temporarily ignore the horrible condition his body was in. And they were off for about 2 strokes before someone once again didn't catch their oar into the water properly and all momentum was halted. In response, Bobby Mock barked at Hume to take the stroke up to 38 in order to gain up lost ground, and after a few hundred meters, he eased them back to 34. They tailed the British by about half a boat's length, and then about halfway through the race, the Japanese leaders faded, which was expected, unable to keep up their 50-plus stroke rate, I guess, and suddenly it was a 2-horse race, and a game of cat and mouse. Mock took the stroke rate up to 36 to see what would happen, and the British boat responded up to 38. There they sat until 250 meters to go, when Mock screamed at Hume and the rest of the boys for 10 big ones, and the Husky Clipper snapped forward. After the 10, they kept the stroke high, close to the furious 40s, as the British boat struggled to hold them off. Here's how kind of Brown describes the scene. In the last 20 strokes, and particularly in the last 12 gorgeous strokes, they simply powered past the British boat, decisively and unambiguously. As they streaked over the finish line, Don Hume collapsed forward over his oar and basically passed out. It was a miracle he had even been able to get out of bed, let alone row a race. Let alone a race in a boat that had just set a new Olympic record. Ulbrichtsen was delighted, but not for long. Hume, it seemed, had taken an even worse turn. It did not look like he could get out of bed in 2 days' time. The next day, they watched as Britain, Germany, and Italy won their last chance repechage races, and they would join the previous day's winners of Hungary and Switzerland to set up an all-European final, except for the Americans, of course. Ulbrichtsen was optimistic given their presumed lane assignments. His was the fastest boat after all, until he wasn't. To this day, no one knows the formula used by the organizing committee, or if there even was a formula. The US was assigned lane 6 and Britain number 5, the 2 fastest boats way out in the middle of the lake. In contrast, the Germans and Italians were in lanes 1 and 2. The fastest lanes were for the host nation and her closest fascist ally, and the slowest lanes to her forthcoming enemies. It was deeply suspicious. The outside lanes, if any sort of wind was blowing, would have to overcome at least a 2-boat handicap in order to just draw level with lanes 1 and 2, let alone row past them. The next day, the rain came down and the wind picked up, of course. Just as they had feared, a nasty handicap had just been placed on them. To make matters worse, Don Hume's fever had worsened. He lay in bed burning up. Ulbrichtsen decided he would not row. He couldn't row, and announced that the replacement would be brought in again. But after breakfast, the rest of the crew rounded on him, begging to put him in the boat. The boys said that they were willing to drag him across the line, that they were a team, and without him they couldn't row. Ulbrichtsen relented. Hume would row, or at least attempt to. The rain continued steadily into the afternoon as the earlier races began. Around 75,000 fans gathered and were delighted when Germany dominated. In fact, out of the first 6 events, Deutschland won 5. The crowd was working itself into a patriotic frenzy that was set to reach its peak during the 8-man race. But before that race could begin, the patriotic chants of Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland took a more sinister turn as Adolf Hitler and several of his most senior staff arrived. The crowd were now properly whipped into a frenzy, with various Heils being chanted and the Nazi salute being offered in Hitler's general direction by the vast majority of the crowd. Joe Rance and the crew found themselves at the center of a vast, almost overwhelming scene. It was like nothing any of them had ever seen before or would ever see again. Just before 6 p.m., the boys huddled on the dock for the last time before slowly paddling away from the crowds towards the start line. As they moved away from the protection of the grandstands, Bobby Mark realized just how much of an issue the wind was. It was gusting in at a 45-degree angle. He would have much preferred an even stronger headwind than what it was to this sort of wind. Every second, Mark was manipulating the rudder to try and keep the Husky clippers straight. And the waves meant catching a clean stroke was exponentially harder. As they sat as still as possible at the start line, fighting the wind, Mark kept one eye over his shoulder for the starter and one on the boat. In the next lane, the British Cox was doing the same. Brown describes the situation. Behind them and out of sight, the official starter suddenly emerged, holding a flag aloft. Almost immediately, he turned slightly in the direction of lanes 1 and 2 and shouted into the wind in French, "Are you ready? Go!" and dropped the flag. Bobby Mock never heard him, never saw the flag. The Husky clipper, for a horrific moment, sat motionless at the line, dead in the water. And then, all 8 oars dug in and the boat heaved forward. Immediately, for the third race in a row, Mark made Hume take the stroke rate up, way up to 38 to catch up to the field before settling back to 35. Still much too fast for his liking, but a rate that was kind of needed to stay within a couple of lengths of the lead. Instead of conserving energy for the forthcoming sprint, Mark had his crew close to a sprinting pace within the first few hundred meters. He quickly calculated that they might have a little left in the tank at the end, but surely not much. At the 300-meter mark, Mark glanced at Hume and his stomach dropped. Hume had gone deathly pale, his mouth open and his eyes were all but closed, his head pointed towards his lap. The stroke was still keeping the rhythm perfectly, but Mark didn't really know if he knew what was going on. As they moved further out into the lake, the winds grew worse and the waves larger. The Americans kind of began to drag and lag behind. At the halfway mark, they were 5 seconds off the pace, a few boat lengths behind Germany and Italy. Mark decided to act. It was way too early to begin sprinting, but they needed to do something. He needed to do something. He barked at Hume to take the stroke rate up, but there was no response. Hume was in a trance, on a different planet most likely. Mark tried not to panic. He decided to do something he'd never done before and communicate the stroke rate change to Joe Rance in the seat behind Hume. As he leaned forward to relay the message, Hume snapped back into life and locked his eyes into Mark. And now the stroke rate began to rise, to 36 and then 37, and so they began to move. With 500 meters left, they had improved to third place, still a length behind the leaders, but closing. And now the Husky clipper finally entered into sheltered water, water that lanes 1 and 2 had been in the whole time. For the first time in the race, Mark eased the rudder to dead straight and they began to properly fly. With 300 meters to go, they had clawed back to level with the leaders and then slightly ahead. And now Mark lied. He just straight lied to his men. 20 strokes left, he screamed. 19, 18, 17, 16, 15. And each time he got to 15, it was back up to 20. This was straight sprint mode. The stroke rising all the way up to the 40s, all the way to 44, faster than they'd ever rode. Past exhaustion, bodies screaming in pain, they obeyed their cruel pace setter and Mark, who suddenly they could no longer hear. That actually pulled level with the grandstands and the cacophony of Deutschland, Deutschland, Deutschland was all that could be heard. Mock decided to start hitting the side of the boat faster and faster to communicate the stroke pace. He glanced over at the surging Germans and Italians and began rapping even faster against the hull. It was beyond what the bodies should be capable of. Excruciating pain was racking their bodies. In the last few strokes, each boat held the lead for a fraction of a second, until with one last almighty pull, the Americans streaked across the finish line. 0.6 of a second behind was Italy, and 4 more tenths behind them were the Germans. Over 2,000 meters, only 1 second separated gold through bronze. The chance of Deutschland shut off immediately. Don Hume slumped over as if in prayer, and the rest of the crew gasped to catch their breaths. An Olympic miracle had just taken place. Rural, poor, blue-collar Washington Huskies had triumphed despite the smallest of odds. The celebrations both in Europe and back home in Washington were glorious. Now, we've sort of come to the crescendo of the tale here, but I want to touch on one more thing briefly. The next year, the same exact crew, minus Bobby Mock, who had graduated, repeated at Poughkeepsie to give Ulbrichtsen another sweep with all 3 crews. After that race, the legendary Syracuse coach, a man by the name of Jim Ten Eyck, gave his opinion. Ten Eyck was born in 1851, and he was reputed to have rowed his first competitive race in 1863, the day after the Battle of Gettysburg. Now at 85, he had been coaching since before the turn of the century and had over 70 years of rowing experience. He declared Joe Rantz's crew as the greatest 8 I ever saw, and I never expect to see another like it. And that's where we'll leave the tale. Now it's time to move on to analysis, and I'll be completely honest with you. After spending over 2 months researching for this episode, I'm sort of hesitant to dive deep into analyzing this team. I think there's sort of something unanalyzable here, some sort of magic ingredient that we can't pull out and apply to our own teams. I feel like I'm also losing the purity of the story by like subjecting it to like a cold analysis. Nonetheless, with those caveats out the way, the whole point of this sort of section is to try and grasp what strategies, what tactics gave this team an outsized competitive advantage against its peers. Or put more simply, what made it better than the rest? So I'm going to touch on a couple of the key overarching themes that I identified. These aren't going to be surprises to you. Firstly, the transformation from individuals to a collective team. As we've mentioned, Joe Rantz was an individual. Coming into college, he wouldn't trust anyone. He couldn't even trust his own family. So, breaking free from that individualistic streak was the most important thing he could do to help the boat, more than any technique improvement or strength work. In fact, most of the other boys had something of a similar story. Being able to completely trust that the man in front and behind you is doing exactly the same thing as you at the same speed over and over and over is a very difficult thing. And all of them accomplished it. When they won in Poughkeepsie, I described them rowing down the race course like this. The boat now began to fly. It came out of the water as the 8 boys rowed as one perfectly oiled machine. This was no boat. This was a well-oiled machine. In fact, Brown literally says this best. No other sport demands and rewards the complete abandonment of the self the way that rowing does. Great crews may have men or women of exceptional talent or strength. They may have outstanding coxswains or stroke oars, but they have no stars. The team effort, the perfectly synchronized flow of muscle and oars, boat and water, the single, whole, unified, and beautiful symphony that a crew in motion becomes is all that matters. Not the individual, not the self. So that was the first sort of theme, the individuals into collective. And next, the power of character and humility. As I mentioned a couple of times, the 9 men in this crew were good people from humble backgrounds. And one example of this shines through in a pretty obvious way. Each of them believed that they were the weakest link in the crew. They all felt like they didn't belong and were fortunate to be surrounded by exceptional athletes who covered their poor output with more effort. Having such humility spread throughout the members of the team was invaluable in that each of them tried harder and harder to improve and not let their teammates down because they assumed that they were. Another aspect of the crew's character is the simple truth that they were even able to get to the University of Washington. As I mentioned in passing, these were poor young men, and once they had made the team, they continued to willingly spend thousands of hours in pain in order to not let the others down. Because you know for certain that none of them were rowing for the adulation or praise that would come. Although, I guess in Joe Rance's case, he was rowing for a part-time job, as were some of the others. And actually, those hours of miserable practice in horrible conditions sort of remind me of something I heard a long time ago on another podcast. Joe DeSena, I think I'm pronouncing that right, who founded the Spartan race, talked about his hiring preference for downhill skiers, something very specific, right? He said on the Tim Ferriss podcast, if you're a racer and you've raced a large part of your life, you probably stood on top of the mountain for hours freezing, waiting for your slot to go. And that builds grit. Standing still in the cold, getting pounded takes a certain skill set. In uncomfortable boots and uncomfortable weather and gear, it is a 50% miserable experience. Don't you think the parallel here is uncanny? Those who have been through hardships develop grit, and when that is paired with humility and a good nature, and you can find 9 of those people, put them together, working towards a hard task, more often than not, something good is going to happen. So next is my favorite stat. In 4 years of competitive rowing, Joe Rance, along with 2 other classmates that were in that Olympic boat, they rowed approximately 4,344 miles in practice for only 28 miles of competitive rowing. And over those 28 miles, they never lost. They won every single race. And now my favorite quote. I'm going to do 2 of them. They're actually both from Pocock. It's a great art is rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion. And when you're rowing well, why? It's nearing perfection. And when you're nearing perfection, you're touching the divine. It touches the you of yous, which is your soul. And then the next one is, in a sport like this, hard work, not much glory, but still popular in every century, well, there must be some beauty which ordinary men can't see, but extraordinary men do. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of Incredible Teams. And this was a very incredible team. If you like this, you should definitely go and buy the book. It's truly incredible. There's so many things I left out. And the writing that Brown has in there is beautiful. Back to the episode, I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. So please comment on this on Spotify or YouTube, or feel free to message me. Subscribe if you like what you heard, and help me pick out who to cover next. And if you did like it, I would love if you could tell a friend about the episode. That's the way that this thing grows. So thank you so much. See you on the next episode, and take care. Thanks.